All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's workshop with the Holding Space Foundation. I'm so excited that we have Dr. Franco with us. So today we will be obviously getting some good details, and just remember this will be recorded for you. And I just definitely want to introduce her. So as an enlightened psychologist, TED speaker, and New York Times bestseller, Dr. Marisa G. Franco is known for digesting and communicating science in ways that resonate deeply enough with people to change their lives. She's a professor at the University of Maryland and author of the New York Times bestseller Platonic: How the Science of Attachment can help you make and keep friends. She writes about friendship for Psychology Today and has been featured connection expert for major publications like the New York Times, the Telegraph, and Vice. She speaks on belonging at corporations, government agencies, nonprofits, and universities. And I definitely want to let you know, for tips on friendship, you can visit her Instagram page, Dr. Marisa G. Franco, or go to her website, www.drmarisagfranco.com, where you can take a quiz to assess your strengths and weaknesses as a friend and reach out to her for speaking engagements. So I'm definitely going to add those to the chat, and you'll receive them when you get the recording as well. All right, Dr. Franco, it is on you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. So happy to be here today to be talking about managing loneliness in 2024. I actually teach a class on loneliness. It's on why we're all so lonely and what we can do about it. So this is a topic I've been thinking about for a very long time. First, just wanted to thank the Holding Space Foundation for bringing us together today. Naisha and Kia for doing all the behind the scenes work with me. Obviously, Dr. Joy Harden Bradford, the mastermind behind all of this. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the importance of connection, why we need friends, why we need community, how loneliness impacts us, right? Because to try to find connection when you're lonely is different from trying to find connection when you don't feel lonely. And I'll get into that a little bit later. I'm going to give us some practical tips on how to find connection and how to make friends. So, first, I just want to say if you're experiencing loneliness, that you're normal. Anywhere from 20 to 50% of the American population is experiencing loneliness at a given time. If you are feeling like you have your community and you're thriving and you're flourishing, you are in the minority. So I just wanted to start this presentation by saying loneliness is not something we should blame on ourselves. There's many systemic reasons why we are so lonely right now collectively as a society. And just some data on this, as you can see, in 1990, about 3% of people had no friends, but by 2021, that was 12%. So fourfold increase in the amount of people that have no friends. Whereas in 1990, about 1 out of every 3 people had 10 or more friends. And by 2021, it's down to about 1 out of every 8, 13% of people. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. They have to do with technology. People think it's the pandemic where loneliness really started, but these trends have started since the 1950s with the creation of the television. People used to spend leisure around other people. Then they started spending it in their homes. Things got a lot worse in 2012 when we all got smartphones. But there's other reasons for that too. Feel free to ask me in the Q&A a little bit more about that. And so why is this really a crisis that we're all just getting lonelier and lonelier and lonelier? Well, connection is really vital for both our physical and mental health. So this study looked at differences between people that were very happy and very unhappy. And it looked at things like their level of spirituality, exercise, how much exercise people did, and
I'm so sorry. If you can please all mute ourselves. Right. I'm sorry, Dr. Franco. I'm not muted, and Camille, you're not muted. I'm sorry about that. Right.
okay, thank you.
Thank you. Fabiola, you're not muted either. Huh.
Oh, it might be a way we can mute
Yeah.
her as like host or something. All right, there we go. Thank you. So yeah, like I was saying, the differences between people that were very more social connection compared to the people that were very unhappy. This study came out of the UK. It was data from over 100,000 people that looked at the factors that predicted depression. What is most predictive of depression? or not having depression. They looked at things like taking naps, time spent in nature, green space, and they found that the number one thing that predicted depression was whether you had someone to confide in. So out of all the 106 factors that they looked at, having a confidant was the number one factor that protected people against depression. So this is, sweeping consequences for our mental health, right? The number one predictor of depression being about how connected you are. When we look at the data on suicidality, there's a theory that the biggest predictors of suicidality both have to do with breakdown in social connection. One is thwarted belonging, feeling like you don't belong. And then the other is perceived burdensomeness, feeling like a burden to other people. Now, what people don't tend to think about is how connection also impacts us physically. When we're connected, we cope with stress better. When we are connected, we see threats as less threatening. When we're connected, we release oxytocin, which is a hormone called the love hormone, but it's also like the fountain of youth. Like it keeps us young, so it does double duty. And so that's part of the reason why we see connection between our level of connectedness and our mortality risks. So research has found meta-analyses, which are basically research studies that combine all the existing research studies. They find that exercise decreases our risk of death by 23 to 30%, that diet, eating vegetables, decreases our risk of death by 24%, but that a large social network decreases our risk of death by 45%. Now, that's the combined impact of diet and exercise on our mortality risk, right? So when I tell my students these stats, sometimes they're like, so I can just sit on the couch, eat candy, and hang out with my friends. And I say, of course we should be doing all these things, good nutrition, good exercise, and being socially connected, but we certainly shouldn't neglect the value of social connection when it comes to our health, because there's some of us who are very health focused. You can find us at the gym, 5 days a week, but we're not necessarily setting aside that time to spend with our social connections, even though that is the most important thing for our health. Now, like I said, connecting when you feel lonely actually tends to be much more difficult. We tend to think about loneliness as a feeling, but loneliness actually changes the way we perceive everything around us. If you think about this from like a historical evolutionary perspective, if you were lonely, you were separated from your tribe on the African savanna where the saber-toothed tigers were there, where there are all these threats around you, and it meant that you were in danger. And so what happens, because that's how we were evolved to experience loneliness, that we are in a state of danger, is that when we're lonely, we perceive the world as so much more threatening. We think people are out to get us, out to harm us, even when they're not. We then become more hostile and judgmental than we are when we're not lonely. If you find yourself thinking things like, nobody likes me, thinking things like, they're going out of their way to hurt me, right? These are things that our lonely brain tells us. But before I get into that, I wanted to share the 3 different types of loneliness. Now, loneliness is really the subjective sense that you don't have the connection you want. Isolation is I'm not actually around other people, but you could feel lonely when you're isolated. You could not feel lonely. Some people are like, I like being isolated. That's my alone time. But there's actually 3 different types of loneliness. For many of us in the pandemic, I lived with a partner. We, even living with one person, I still felt pretty lonely. And that's because we have the desire for intimate connection. Intimate loneliness means that you are not experiencing that desire for, you're not experiencing deep, intimate connection. But there's also relational loneliness, which is the desire for someone as close to you as a friend. And then collective loneliness, which is a desire for a group working toward a common goal, right? So even if you find a spouse that you really love, you can still feel lonely because there's these 3 different types of loneliness. Even if you have a couple of good friends and a spouse that you love, you could still feel lonely because maybe you're not experiencing collective connection. You're not feeling like you're part of a larger group. Now, this was a study that looked at correlations between loneliness and a bunch of other variables or factors. And the study found that the lonelier people were, as you can see here in the chart with this negative correlation, the less likely they were to accept others, the more powerless they felt, the more isolated they felt, the less trusting they felt, the less altruistic they felt. They were more likely to view the world as more unjust, view human nature as untrustworthy, not altruistic. So again, what this research really shows us is that loneliness isn't just about I feel lonely. It's about I perceive everything around me differently. I perceive other people as out to get me, out to harm me compared to when I don't feel lonely. Now, this study, people were basically hypnotized to think about an experience of social exclusion or an experience of belonging. And after that, they reported on things like their mood, their anxiety, their anger. As you can see here in the high lonely condition, thinking about social exclusion, it again doesn't just affect people's feelings of loneliness, it puts them in a worse mood. They feel less positively, they feel more anxious, they feel more angry. They report this fear of negative evaluation, which is really what we see when we're lonely. We just really think everyone's going to reject us. So, me knowing this research, I know that I could get lonelier on the weekends when I'm not going to work, right? And knowing that means that I need to reach out to people on the weekdays when I'm feeling more connected. Because I know once I get to that state of loneliness, I'm going to start thinking no one wants to hear from me. I'm going to start thinking they're going to reject me. It's going to be a lot harder to reach out. Knowing this means that we can start to prepare for our loneliness before we get into that state of loneliness. This other data that finds that we really tend to assume people don't like us when we're lonely. At 3 weeks and 3 months, people were in a classroom and they were asked to assess how much they thought their peers in the class liked them. And the lonelier they were, the more they thought their peers saw them negatively. Now, this wasn't true most of the time. Only at 3 weeks were men more likely to actually be viewed more negatively. Women, us women, or non-binary, I don't know what folks' identity is. We weren't any more likely to be perceived negatively. Loneliness was just the lens through which we assumed that we were perceived negatively, but that wasn't actually true. And then this is just going off of the same findings when kids were presented with stories of an ambiguous social rejection, which basically was, you read this story about a peer that says, hey, I know you want to work with me on the group project, but I already have a group member. Better luck next time. And the lonelier kids were, the more likely they were to assume that that was personal, and the more likely they wanted to report revenge on that person in this hypothetical story, the more likely they wanted to be hostile right back. So what I want to offer, why I want to offer this research to you, is for us all to know when we are in that lonely state, to not believe what's going on in our heads, right? To be able to say, oh, I may think everyone hates me because I'm lonely. I may be seeing the worst in our friendship because I'm lonely. Maybe I'm in a bad mood and I don't know why. And it might be because I'm lonely. And for you to be able to crane your neck in the balcony above yourself and above your thoughts and say, wow, like, maybe people actually like me a lot more than I might be thinking when I'm in this really lonely state and I'm feeling like people really don't like me. In fact, we see in the research that one of the most effective interventions to target loneliness, what they do is that they give people hope. They give people optimism that you can get out of this loneliness, that it is not forever, that it's something temporary. And the people that stay in the loneliness, they tend to believe there's something wrong with me. So this will never change. There's something wrong with everyone else. Humans are just awful. And so they get caught in the loneliness because the more you think about the more you make these interpretations that are it's because of me or because everyone else sucks rather than this is temporary and I'll be able to get out of it, the more likely you are to continue to withdraw and continue the cycle of loneliness. Okay, so I guess this is what the research we've been reviewing so far is really getting at. The quality of our relationships determines the quality of our lives. So now that we know a little bit about how loneliness impacts the way we're thinking, impacts the way we see others around us, right? And we've begun to question, okay, is it maybe other people are more open than I might be thinking when I'm lonely? We've begun to question, okay, maybe my friends, maybe they might like me more than I might be assuming, right? We begin to bring ourselves in a place to form connection, right? When we detach ourselves from some of these thinking patterns that we have when we're lonely. But as we ready ourselves for connection, we need to figure out how to do it. How do you make friends as an adult? It always feels kind of confusing, really, really baffling. And I think one of the things we're up against when it making friends is this assumption. Friendship should just happen organically. We've heard this over and over and over again. I don't think I should have to try. It should just flow. It should be easy, right? And this is what I thought. This is me about to go to NYU, got my little NYU pillow right there. Scared about making friends in college, telling myself, well, it's going to happen organically. Now, let me tell you why we make this assumption. There's a sociologist, Rebecca G. Adams, and she kind of analyzed the research on friendship. And she said, when three conditions are in place, friendship can kind of just happen. And those are proximity, we're located near someone. We have repeated unplanned interactions like school, kind of like these regular times to meet up that nobody plans, that are just in our calendars. And we have shared vulnerability. We confide in each other. And so what Rebecca G. Adams points to here is that when we're in school, we had these ingredients. We were near our friends. We saw them Monday to Friday. It wasn't so formal. So we could share things with each other over lunch, in gym class, in art class, over recess. But what we don't realize as adults, many of us have no environments in our lives with these three ingredients. We might go to work where we see people every day, but we certainly don't feel comfortable getting truly vulnerable with them. I mean, in most workplaces. And I know there's specific repercussions when you're a Black woman and you're vulnerable. And there's this fear that it could really be used against you. That's real. And so, what that means is that if you're relying on the same set of assumptions that you had when you were a kid, that it's just going to happen, and you're not realizing that you're in this difficult circumstance, then you're going to end up lonely if you have this assumption that it's just going to happen organically. Now, here's some research that supports that. This was a research on older adults in Canada that found that when people thought friendship was made based on effort, they were actually lonelier 5 years later. But when people thought friendship was something that happened based on, sorry, they were less lonely 5 years later. But when people thought friendship was something that happened based on luck, they were lonelier 5 years later. Why does having the perception that friendship takes effort make you less lonely? Because you're more likely to make the effort. You show up at the place of worship, you volunteer, you put yourself out there, right? The reason that this idea that friendship happens organically is sabotaging us is because it's leading us to be very passive when it comes to connection. Now, when I tell people you have to initiate, you have to put yourself out there, what I get back is fears of rejection, right? It's very scary for us as human beings to say, hey, I've enjoyed your company. I would love to hang out. Would you be open to that? But what I wanted to share with you is the research on something called the liking gap. Now, this is this finding that when strangers interact across a few different settings in this study, in the community center, in the laboratory, and they had a conversation and they were asked, hey, how much do you like that person? How much do you think they like you? The study found that generally people tend to underestimate how liked they are by other people. So this research tells us we are less likely to get rejected than we think we are. Now, in this study, Nicholas Epley head researchers basically told people on their commute to open up conversation with a stranger. Now, when people predict how open people will be when they strike up conversation, they tend to predict, okay, about 40% of the time, someone's going to be open to talking to me. What ends up coming out in the data is that about 90% of the time, strangers are open to talking to people when they initiate conversation. And so in Nicholas Epley's study, where he had people open up conversation with people on their commute, he found that no one was turned down. And so this is a quote from his study. Commuters appeared to think that talking to a stranger posed a meaningful risk of social rejection. As far as we can tell, it posed no risk at all. Now, my students listen to this study and they're like, well, what city was that in? Because it was not Washington, D.C. It was not New York City. This study took place in Chicago, but the similar study that found that 90% of the time strangers were open to chatting, that study took place in London, which is definitely not a city known for its warm communal vibes. So because of this research that finds that we're less likely to be rejected than we think, one of my tips when it comes to connecting with others is to try to assume that people are going to like you. Now, this is based in the data. When people are told, hey, based on your personality profile, we as the researchers predict you will go into a group and be liked. And this is a complete lie. It's called fabrication, deceit on the part of the researchers. But what they found is that when people make that assumption, they go into the group, they're friendlier, they're warmer, they're more open, and it ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy called the acceptance prophecy. If people expect acceptance, they will behave warmly, which in turn will lead other people to accept them. Now, think about if you expect rejection. You expect someone to reject you. How do you respond to them? You're closed off, you're withdrawn, you're keeping the conversation short. You're rejecting people, and then they reject you back. And that's why assuming you'll be rejected really can become a self-fulfilling prophecy too, because it causes you to do the rejecting first. You know, as a college professor, I took students on a trip to the aquarium, and I see the loner students, and they're all alone. And I know that they're on these trips to find people to connect to, but I see them with their AirPods in the corner in their ears for the entire time. And it's clearly very difficult for students to approach them, right? Because they seem so withdrawn, even though they really, really want to connect. Okay, so assuming people like you is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So now we know we need to initiate, we need to put ourselves out there, right? We need to find places to interact with people. And once we find people to interact with, right, we overcome overt avoidance. We go to that concert, we go to that networking event, we go to that language class. And so we overcome overt avoidance by showing up. But we also have to overcome something called covert avoidance, which is when we show up, but we check out mentally. We're on our phone, we're in the corner, we're talking to the one person we already knew at the event. We're not actually engaging with people. Now, to find connection, it's not enough to just show up at the, cornhole group. You actually have to say to people when you get there, hi, my name's Betty. It's great to meet you. How are you enjoying this? Can you give me any tips, right? You have to engage with other people. Now, just an example of how I've applied some of these tips in my own life. It was March of 2020, a time that I already apologized for bringing us all back to, and I had bought an apartment. And I decided I bought this place. I want to invest in it. I really want to become friends with my neighbors. So one day, before everything went down, I was walking in the hallway and I saw my neighbor in the hallway talking to another neighbor. And in my head, I'm like, this is my chance. I can make friends. Like, I could just introduce myself. But of course, I get really nervous and scared, and I kind of like squirm back into my apartment. And my ex-partner who was living with me at the time, he kind of threw me back into the hallway and he said, "What are you writing that book for? Like, you got to put that into practice." So as I'm stumbling back into the hallway, I'm thinking about all these principles. I'm thinking that if I want to be friends with my neighbors, it's not just going to happen. I'm thinking that she's less likely to reject me than I think she is. This is going to go better than I think. I'm thinking that I have to assume that she's going to like me, right? Like, even though I'm scared, there's a part of me that's hopeful, and I have to lean into that part and think that this might go well. And I'm thinking, I have to overcome not just overt avoidance by standing in this hallway awkwardly beside her, but also covert avoidance by saying hello to her. So I approach her. Her name's Zaria. Y'all, she's super friendly. I'm like, the research is right. We start chatting. At some point, I'm like, so is there like a group for us neighbors to stay connected? And she says, we do have this cat sitting group. So I think to myself, well, I guess I'll take connection in whatever form it comes to me in. And I had to cat sit a lot of cats to get into that group. But every Friday of the pandemic, that group was a lifesaver because we hung out in the garden behind our apartment building. And it really was a saving grace. And I think sometimes we think a tiny act like saying hello can't forever change the course of our friendships, but it absolutely can, because about a year later, Zaria formally sat me down and asked me to be her best friend. And about a month ago, we were in Buenos Aires together. Okay, so tips for initiating. Overcome overt and covert avoidance. Find places to interact with people, and once you do, engage with them when you get there. Try to assume people like you. It's okay if you're scared. It's okay if you have doubts, right? But just remember, that's not all of you. There's also a part of you that's like hopeful, and you can lean into that part. Reconnect. That's a great tip for initiating is, are there people you were in contact with a year ago that you wish you didn't fall out of contact with? You could look through your DMs from Instagram for last year. You could look through your text messages from last year. Very recently, I had work friend reach out to me. We went to dinner yesterday, the four of us from a previous job. And we hadn't talked for over a year, but she reached out and we all reconnected. And research actually finds that people appreciate an act of reconnection more than we think, more than we would predict. And I just think it's great to ask people in your life, like, hey, I'm really trying to like get out there and meet new people. Is there anyone you know who you think I might connect well with? I love this strategy because it brings us people that are pre-vetted. If they're friends of our friends, automatically there's like a greater degree of similarity. This is also a great tip if you're moving to a new city. I went to Mexico City for 2 weeks solo. Before I did, I asked people, hey, do you know anyone in Mexico City? Do you know anyone in Mexico City? So when I got there, I already had a lunch date planned with a friend of a friend. Okay. Woo, this is a tough one. Sharing things about yourself burdens people, right? So this myth, this idea that we should never be vulnerable, we should keep things to ourselves. For Black women, we have this research concept called the strong Black woman schema. We always have to be strong. We can't necessarily be vulnerable to other people. We always have to be the one to hold it all together, right? And then who's holding us together? Um, but we see in the research, and this is certainly what I thought and what I have practiced. I thought everyone needs me to be impressive and perfect. And if I'm impressive and perfect, everybody is going to love me because everyone wants to be friends with a perfect person who reminds them how inadequate they are. So I wasn't necessarily vulnerable, going into college. I just tried to come off as almost like superior, I guess, because I thought it was what would make me friends. But what we see in the research is that when high school students transition to college, those who suppress their emotions, those who are invulnerable, once they got to college, they experienced less support from others. They had less close relationships. They were less satisfied with their relationships. We also see from another meta-analysis combining all the existing research that the more we intimately self-disclose, the more liked we are. Now, research also finds that we like people who we've intimately self-disclosed to. That's why we all love our therapists. So self-disclosure, vulnerability, it really is a two-way streak of connection in that it makes people feel close to us and it makes us feel closer to them. So if vulnerability is so powerful for creating connection, why does it feel so scary? Now, this is a theme in the connection research that you may have noticed so far. When we predict the impact of our behaviors, we tend to see it cynically. We tend to think the impact is going to be more negative than it actually is when we reconnect with people, when we talk to strangers, when we initiate, right? We perceive that people are going to view us more negatively than they actually end up viewing us. And this is true for vulnerability too. It's called the beautiful mess effect. In this study, people imagine disclosing their flaws to someone. Imagine talking about how the insecurities you feel in your body or a mistake you made at work. And imagine how it would come off. And they reported that it would come off negatively. But when they imagine other people doing the same exact thing, they imagine it would come off more positively. And so that's always my reminder. Since, there are things that feel very vulnerable to me, like asking for help, for example, has always felt very vulnerable to me. And so knowing that we have these biases in how we view the impact of our vulnerable behaviors, I sometimes have to pause and ask myself, well, what if this person asked me for help in this way? What if that happened? And I thought to myself, well, if this person asked me for help, I would love to help them. It would be wonderful to express all the love that I have towards them. And then I remind myself, okay, if this is how I would react, then that's probably a more accurate appraisal of how they'll react to me than my own predictions, which is going to be more biased toward the negative. Now, the other thing about vulnerability, remember when I shared with you that study that out of 106 factors that predict depressive symptoms, the number one protective factor was having someone to confide in. Vulnerability is very important for our mental health and well-being. So this study basically looked at sharing secrets and how they impacts their people's well-being. And so what the study found is that people that were best able to cope with their secret is that they shared that secret. And someone responded lovingly and positively, right? And then they internalized that and they were better able to cope with the secret. So that's like how we heal. We just take in the healing energy from others over time. Like that's kind of what therapy is. But the caveat here is that the people who are also least able to cope with the weight of their secrets, they also disclose their secret, but they disclosed it to someone who didn't respond positively. And then they felt worse about their secret. So, what this study really tells us is it's not just about willy nilly vulnerability all the time, it's about discernment plus vulnerability. How can I be vulnerable with someone who I trust, who I've built up a relationship with, who makes me feel safe, who feels good for my nervous system, who doesn't share things in confidence from other people, right? It's being very intentional about being vulnerable with people that we feel comfortable being vulnerable with. Now, some of us who've always struggled with vulnerability, we may have what's called an avoidant attachment style, which means that we really like to keep people at a distance. And even if someone is very open and warm towards us, we still assume that they're going to hurt us or see us as pathetic or weak if we're vulnerable. And so if that's you, what I would ask you is to think about what evidence have they given me that they're not trustworthy, right? Is this just an assumption that I'm making, or is there actual evidence here to suggest that they're going to judge me or be hostile with me towards my secret? And that helps you piece apart, is this something that I'm projecting based on past experiences, or is this me tuning into the dynamic of this relationship when I make assumptions about how safe or not safe someone is? So when I interviewed Dr. Michael Slepian, he has this book, The Secret Life of Secrets, conducted that last study. I said, what's one piece of advice you give to people dealing with their weight of their secrets? And he said, the one thing that I would tell them is they're going to have to find a place to share them. And it reminded me of when I was in my therapy training, one of the supervisors we had said, anything unspeakable to you is still affecting you. Okay, so bringing more vulnerability to our friendships, ask deeper questions. What's the last thing you learned? The last time you felt pure joy? One way that you're looking to grow, shake up the social script in terms of what you're willing to talk about. There's a lot of cool, I have some games right here that do this. I don't know if you've seen like We're Not Really Strangers or Esther Perel. She's like a popular therapist. She's a card game too. So being able to ask those really interesting questions that allow for more vulnerability from others. And then just remembering people will likely receive your vulnerability better than you think. If vulnerability is really hard for you, I recommend scaffolding vulnerability, which means first share a vulnerable thing with the person you trust the most, and then go out to the second most trusted person, and so on and so forth. So you're not just going out into new terrain and being vulnerable. You're giving yourself kind of a step ladder of vulnerability. Okay. Myth number 3 when it comes to social connection. This was me in college. I wanted to make friends. I joined this social group once. I go once and nobody's talking to me. And I think this is a very cliquey place and I never come back. So many assumptions embedded in my thinking and interpretation of the time. One was I was thinking a lot more about how people were treating me, and I was not thinking about how I was treating them. I expected them to come to me and be warm and be friendly and be inviting, but was I being warm and friendly and inviting right back? No, I wasn't, right? And so I had to hold myself accountable more and see myself as an active agent rather than a passive recipient in the social environment. The other thing that I was assuming is that, well, if I don't feel the spark, if I don't click when I first meet them, that I'm never going to become close to these people. And that's just not how our relationships work, right? Like our brains are designed to be weary of what is unfamiliar. So when we first meet people, it can feel like this, like, oh my gosh, hyenas all around me. I don't feel comfortable here. I want to pull away. I want to withdraw. It's not just you that feels that way. But once people become familiar to us, once we see them repeatedly over time, they start to feel more like this, like cute little puppies, like, oh, yay. And that's the research phenomenon behind this is called the mere exposure effect. Mere exposure effect is a term to describe our our liking of people merely because we've been exposed to them. So, study that kind of demonstrates this effect found that when these psychology professors planted these women into a large psychology lecture, at the end of the semester, they were given pictures of these women. And one of the women didn't show up for any classes, and one of the women showed up for most classes. Now, the students reported that they didn't remember any of the women because, again, it was a large psychology lecture. But when they were asked, how much do you like each of these women? They liked the woman who showed up for the most classes 20% more than the one that didn't show up for any. Now, again, they didn't remember any of these women. So it was completely subconscious. Just being exposed to people's faces made them like this woman more over time. This is also research that finds that when people were brought into a group and they were going to have a discussion group, and they were told that there were certain people in the group that they would see again in ongoing discussion groups with, right? So they were given these profiles of the woman in the discussion group, and they were told, okay, some of these women in this group you're going to see again repeatedly. And at the end of the discussion group, they reported how much they liked each of these women, and they reported liking the profile of the woman they'd presumably see again. So when we think we'll see someone again, we like them more, all other things being equal, is what this study shows us. So what does that mean? It means that if you are able to connect with people that are your neighbors or they're your colleagues, right? You have that anticipation of seeing each other again. So there's already an increased investment and an increased liking. For me, if I have a new neighbor, I will certainly say hi, welcome them to the apartment, bring them some cookies, get to know them, because I know that's low-hanging fruit. We have exposure already. We're both more invested in this relationship because of that. So some tips to increase exposure. First of all, knowing the mere exposure effect means that you should assume connection is going to be uncomfortable at first. That's not a sign that it's time to eject from the connection. That's just a sign that you haven't built up mere exposure yet. So for me, it was like showing up once and then quitting. What I would recommend is that if you join a social group, if you join a volleyball league or a language class or, CrossFit or whatever it is to you that you're really interested in, stick to it for 2 months before you quit. Give time for mere exposure effect to set in. Just because you're uncomfortable at first doesn't mean that it's not working. It means that you're you're in the process, you're in the journey. Make friends. This is my big tip when it comes to friendship. Often we want to make friends, so we go to one event. We'll go to like a happy hour or something. But instead, join something repeated over time. Instead of choosing a workshop, join a class. Instead of choosing a happy hour, join the board of that organization who plans the happy hours. Because when you see people repeatedly, you have mere exposure effects setting in. And even if you don't even talk to each other, you're going to like them more. They're going to like you more. And then one thing I already mentioned is just making friends with people you already have mere exposure with, those neighbors, your coworkers. The thing that actually started for me writing Platonic was my book on the science of making friends was that I was going through a breakup and I was feeling really sad, and I met up with a friend and I was like, well, what if we create a wellness group where we meet up each week and we practice wellness, we cook, we meditate, we do yoga. And it was life-changing for me. It made me question so many of my assumptions, like, oh, romantic love is the only love that makes me worthy. It's the only love that matters. And I looked around at my friends and I was like, why doesn't this matter? Like, this is a beautiful form of love and it feels so deep and fulfilling. And it's made me feel safer than these romantic relationships I've ever have. And what I did was, I created a group. That's those people that create groups are what I call igniters. And igniters, when I teach my loneliness class, I see one class getting very close, hanging out outside of class, one class not getting close. They don't see each other outside of class. The difference in those two groups is that one group has an igniter. And I had a student, Savannah, who would say, hey, does anyone want to get lunch after class? And then 10 people would show up and 10 more people would have connection because Savannah did that one act, right? And so you can become an igniter. You can set up a regular time to meet with people. This can look like, oh, I want to have co-working Mondays. So I want people to come over and co-work with me on Mondays. We're going to do weekly walks on Saturdays. I had a monthly dinner group. I have a writing critique group where we critique each other's writing. I love it. You automate social interaction and you don't have to try. So you could just say something like, I'm planning on having a few friends over on Wednesday. You don't know each other yet, but I think you get along. Would you be open to doing a regular monthly meetup at this time? Okay, these are just some of my monthly meetups. That was the monthly dinner group. We went to different restaurants around DC. This was just some folks from my writing group, which is still going, for my new book, which is on the science of worthiness. All right, let's get into our last myth so we have some time for the Q&A. And this is really the idea that to be liked, I need to be cool, I need to be funny, I need to be smart. That's the secret to being liked. So I'm going into the groups being like, well, I'm an insightful person. Let me just like whisper psychology studies in people's ears. And then they'll be like, that's fascinating. And I want to be your friend. But what I wish I knew at the time was that people want to be friends with people that make them feel valued and make them feel like they matter. It's not necessarily about who you are, but how you make other people feel that determines whether they want to be friends with you. Affection, showing affection for other people, affirming other people. This is a really important way that we can make friends. Now, some proof of this. When friendship pairs were followed across 12 weeks, they looked at the different factors that predict whether these friendship pairs maintained or deepened. And the one factor that tended to predict whether these friendship pairs continued or deepened was how much affection was shared. The more affection that was shared, the more deepening that occurred of these friendships. Now, when researchers compared, they gave questionnaires to people that were high in affirming others and low in affirming others. They found so many differences in the psychological profiles of these two groups. The high affirmers, less isolated, had fuller social calendars, received more affection right back. They were less depressed too. They had better mental health. They got more dates for those of you that are dating right now, right? So affirming other people, really good way to foster connection. Now, this study directly attested the assumption that I had in college, which was that people want to be friends with someone who's funny, smart, entertaining. And so it asked people, hey, what are the qualities that you rate as most important in a friend? And of the 8 qualities, the number one quality people looked for in a friend was something they called ego support. Someone that made you feel valued, someone that made you feel good about yourself. The least important quality, sorry for all you really funny people out there, was this thing called narrative skill, which was being entertaining and being witty, right? Like that's nice and it's fun to be around, but when people are thinking about who they want to have a deeper connection with, they look for the people that make them feel safe, make them feel valued, make them feel like they matter. I'll just skip this for time purposes. So this is all falling into this theory called the theory of inferred attraction. People like people who they think like them. And this isn't about being people pleasing and saying something that you don't mean, but so many of us think positive thoughts about other people, but we keep them to our chest. We never share them. I know this as a professor, right? My students will never tell me how meaningful the class is until they need a recommendation. And then they'll share all of these things, these lovely things they felt about the class. But what if we freed ourselves up to express affection whenever we thought of affection, whenever we felt affection towards another person? So just some tips for affirming more is when you meet someone, try to ask yourself to look for something you like. Ask yourself, what do you like about them? Make that a practice when you meet new people. You asking yourself, what did I like about that person? And when you like someone, don't keep it close. Just tell them, say, I really enjoyed hanging out with you. Like, these are all the things I really value about you. Friends' birthdays, great time to be extra thoughtful. Write them that card. Sending that random text that we all love receiving, where a friend says, I just, you mean so much to me, and I just don't know if I say that enough. Sending friends dinner when they're sick, also a great way to affirm your friends. The reason being, it's really important to show up in what I call diagnostic moments. And diagnostic moments are moments that we use to diagnose the entire health of the friendship. And these diagnostic moments tend to be when we're at our lowest or when we're at our highest. Because how our memories work is we remember things more when we are experiencing high amounts of emotion, whether positive or negative. So how our friends show up during those emotional periods of great happiness or great sadness tends to really determine how we view the friendship overall. So when your friend's sick, that's an important time to show up, right? When your friend just got in a promotion, that's an important time to say, hey, I'm so proud of you. Like, let me take you out a drink to celebrate. All right, so let's look at our list of takeaways here. How to connect with people. First, initiate, assume people like you, overcome covert and overt avoidance, which means show up at a place where you could connect. But then once you do, engage with people when you get there. Initiate, say, hi, my name is Mary. It's so good to meet you. Disclose, get vulnerable. Remember that people judge us less than we think when we're vulnerable. That's called the beautiful mess effect. And again, it's not about, you don't even have to share your deepest, darkest secrets, but you can just share, I think at the workplace, one thing I say is you can stop talking about work, share your hobbies, share your interests. You like hiking. What's the next place you're going to travel to? Expose, find a way to see people regularly. This can look like joining an event, a class that meets regularly of some sort. I'm currently taking guitar, considering taking guitar lessons at a musical store. But you could also be an igniter, someone who creates the social groups that gives people an opportunity to see each other regularly. And then affirm, look for something to like in everyone that you meet. Now, just a handy dandy acronym so you can remember all of these things. I call this the IDEA model: initiate, disclose, expose, and affirm. Before we go to questions, just want to share where you can find me. Repeat this again. I'm on Instagram sharing tips on the science of connection at Dr. Marisa G. Franco. On my website, you can take a quiz that assesses your strengths and weaknesses as a friend, gives you some tips on how to improve. And I also do speaking events at corporations, colleges, places of worship. You can find my speaking representative on my website too. Her name is Kate Berner. And I also just wanted to mention real quick that when I wrote my book, Platonic, I came across this theory called self-verification theory, which is this finding that we tend to look for people that verify our sense of self. So if we feel bad about ourselves, we actually tend to be attracted to people that treat us more negatively, because when people see us positively, we think, oh, eventually they're going to find out the real me. I feel like an imposter. I feel anxious. And so because of that, I realized that we need to do the internal work to be able to tolerate healthy relationships. And that's what my next book is going to be about, finding worthy, about what's the internal work we can do to get there. And I would love to hear you tell me about your own experiences of worth, whether you feel you struggle with worth, whether you feel really worthy, wherever you're at on the worthiness spectrum. So I just shared a quick survey in the chat if you're interested in being a story in my next book.
Dr. Franco, thank you so much. I just want to say you're so fun. You make this seem so seamlessly. And a couple people said they have your book. If you haven't read it, please do, because it can help you create those ideas which you need to do for yourself. So I'm super excited. It's a new book. Congratulations. So I clicked the link. I have it saved. I will definitely be taking the survey. So thank you.
Thank you.
I don't want to talk so much. I'd love to open up the floor for questions. This was so, just thank you. Thank you so much. And of course, I'd love to get as many people as possible. So if we can keep it a little short, I definitely see Court, and then Mia, you're next.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Franco. So my question for you is two things. I struggle with the follow-up. So I'm good in social settings. Like, I'm good with meeting with people. I will get numbers. I will exchange social medias, whatever. But I am just horrible with the follow-up. And then two, my second. Well, I didn't even finish that question, right? I didn't. How do I get better with follow-up? Because I get anxious, really anxious with following up. But one of the things that which leads into my second question is, right now is not probably like the best chapter of my life. There's a lot going on in my home. And so I just feel like I just don't have conversation. I don't want to be like the negative Nancy. I find that sometimes when I do get in social situations, I am thinking about all the things that's going on in my head, and that's what's coming out of my mouth. You know what I mean? Yep. And so I'm like, man, well, once I do get the number and I do like follow up, it's like I just don't have good conversation. And I didn't do the We Are Strangers, but I did like find some cards on Temu where I could just kind of like ask questions to keep the conversation going. But I just feel like a negative Nancy right now. So how can I just keep the conversations positive without being inauthentic to myself? And how can I like do better with the anxiety of keeping it going and, following up?
Yeah. These are great questions. And I just want to say, like, these struggles are really normal, and I'm sorry that you're going through a lot. I understand why connection can feel really hard when you're going through a lot and you're just like, like I have to play pretend that I'm okay, but I'm not okay, but I also need to be around other people to feel better. So it's just a really complicated place to be. And I've been there too. Just on the research on like creating and forming habits, one thing that I would suggest is that you find a way to automate the follow-up. And what I mean by that is like maybe the second you get into your car, if that's where you're getting, after you meet someone, you're like, this is my follow-up time. I need to pause to follow up. For me, like I live in an apartment building. So I'm like, I'm going to respond to texts in the elevator of the apartment building, right? So that's my cue to like, okay, this is my time to follow up. So figure out what you want your cue to be. Maybe it could even be you have something in your home, like, I don't know, flowers or something. And every time you look at it, it's your reminder to like follow up with people. But you just need a cue, right? You need some sort of cue to remind you, like, okay, I need to remember to follow up with this person. I really need to remember to reach out to those people. So, some ways to insert it automatically into your life. Like, I'm definitely going to do this, right after I get home. I'm definitely going to do this in the elevator. I'm definitely going to do this on my commute tomorrow, right? I'm really going to commit to that. I think it's going to make it a lot easier. In terms of really struggling with how do I kind of keep this conversation lighter when I'm like struggling with so many things, when so many things are difficult, I think you can kind of compromise. Well, first of all, I think if these are like relationships that have been established, it's okay to be vulnerable about what's difficult. People probably want to support you more than you think. But if it's a newer relationship and you're wanting to build that intimacy more over time, you can share maybe the hardship and like things like, this is what I'm learning from like what I'm going through, right? Or this is what I'm realizing that I really want in the future from all after I've gone through all of these things. Like, and what are you realizing that you want for yourself in the future? What's something you've been learning about your life so much now? So instead of like going into all the details of what's going on, you can share like some of your reflections and your experiences that come in relation to what's going on. We can take another question.
Okay, sweet. Court may be driving. That's why. Okay, cool. Court, I hope you got all of that. All right, sweet. Mia.
Hi, Dr. Franco. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the tips. So any tips on how to not become the therapist friend? I feel like I'm always the person that everyone comes to like manage or solve their problems, and I
Yeah.
end up getting drained. So any tips on that?
I relate to you. There's a couple of things that I've learned about myself, and I'm not sure if they will apply to you, but I will share them in case they apply.
Okay.
I recognize that sometimes I listen as a way to guard myself, that it's a way for me to not have to share by being the listener. And in some ways, I end up, um, kind of putting myself in that situation a little bit. And I've learned that like emotional reciprocity is what generates a lot more closeness than one person listening. So being intentional about you sharing too, right? You can ask those questions, but then at some point you got to say, and this is what's going on for me. And I know it's hard because sometimes people don't ask and you ask. So it's like, why are you asking me? But
Yeah,
just being like, okay, I know that this is what I need for the connection. So now I'm going to chime in because that's what a lot of people do. They chime in, us the non-listener types. They just chime in with what's going on for them. So I would say practice chiming in a little bit. Now, if you're in a state where you're just like, so many people are depending on me, I think just using some soft boundary language, which is like, friend, I really want you to be okay, and I know that you might need more support beyond what I can offer you. So like, where else can we make sure that you're able to turn to in all of this, right? Like, tell me about who else like can come in and offer that support, just so we can make sure that you're not feeling unsupported, right? So that kind of really soft boundary language to kind of encourage people. Sometimes with friends, if I have friends that'll send me like anxious texts and I'll be like, I would love to talk about this next time we meet each other. I don't feel like I'm going to be able to give you a good enough response just over text message, right? So that kind of, I always call it like a boundary and an offering. Like, I can't do this, but here's what I could offer you as to where you can get your need met. I can't do this, but here's, this other place that you can turn to. I think can be good ways to try to shake out of that role of being everyone's support system and not necessarily getting the support you need.
I love that. One more quick question. So what happens if you chime in and then they just bring everything back to them and they kind of
Oh gosh. It's hard. It
yeah,
really is hard. I mean, first of all, like, you can be honest with yourself if you're like, well, that's kind of what I need in connection. There are people that like ask me or about me and also seem interested in me. You could also take the risky, vulnerable conversation of being like, hey friend, like I do enjoy listening to you, but like sometimes it feels important for someone to like ask about me too. And I know that I'm not someone who always just brings up my own stuff. So like it would just feel really meaningful to me if you would be willing to just like ask more questions about me too. What do you think? Right? Taking that risk when it comes to the connection, because sometimes I think we're afraid to take these risks because we're like, oh, they're going to say no and it's not going to move forward. But we don't realize if I don't take this risk and our interactions continue to look like that, it's going to end anyway because I'm just going to get so fed up.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was so helpful. Thank you.
And Camille, hi.
Hi, so happy to be here. I'm freaking out. This has been so good. I guess for time, my one question I wanted to ask around like time spent, as far as like on the phone or even in person, if I could get your advice about that. I think I've found myself over time kind of stuck in, oh, let's hang out, let's go get lunch or something. And it turns into like 4 hour, like just these long sessions, or people call and then I'm on the phone for like an hour or two. And I'm trying to get back into that space, but with boundaries, I guess, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Yeah. I think before the hangout, say the boundary. It's harder to say it in the moment. So be like, oh, great, I'm free from 7 to 9, or oh, I'm free from 7 to 7:30 for a little bit of a chat, right? And then if you end up wanting to spend more time, people are so flattered because they're like, oh, look, like she's like pushing back her laundry to talk to me. And I think one tip for like when you are in those long conversations and you want to get out of them and you're like, how the heck do I get out of them, is to say the next thing that you have to do, right? So instead of having to be like, oh, can't talk anymore, you can say, oh, I really have to go cook dinner, or oh yeah, I really had to finish up this work thing, or I really have to go check in with another friend. Like offer the next thing that you have to do as a way to finish off that conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, definitely. Someone sent me a private message via chat, if that's okay, Dr. Franco. Someone immigrated to the US as an adult in their mid-20s, and most women who are their age are in sororities or similar groups. And if you're not a part of those groups, you're like really never included or accepted. You're still viewed as an outsider. So people that follow the no new friends mantra, I'm sure you've heard of that. So how could they find their people?
Okay, here's my tip. When people don't want to hang out with you, walk away, don't work harder. There are people out there who want to spend time with you and who are ready for it, right? And if you keep trying to push with the people that aren't available, you're inviting one-sided relationships into your life. And so turning towards the people that do have the time, that are available, it's going to involve you putting yourself out there. For example, I think if you attend like any sort of like social group, like through meetup.com, or like any sort of like sports league, people that are tending to do a hobby or interest in community, they're inherently there because they want to meet people, because they could be doing this thing alone. They could be, learning Spanish with a private tutor, right? And so that's a great place to meet people that are really available for the connection. I also see when people move to a new city, they're like, I'm doing all the things, but it feels so hard. People aren't available, right? To also just know that this is going to be a process, right? That if it's not happening for you, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing anything wrong. That might just mean that you need to continue the practice over time to be able to find what you're looking for. And that's hard. That sucks. It's really hard to have to put yourself out there continuously. But that's just the nature of connection. Sometimes I find people, they reach out once, someone's like, oh, I can't, and then they never reach out again, right? But that's all part of the process, the pain, the rejection. That's not a sign that you're doing something wrong. That just means that you're on the right path in the journey, and that not every battle will be fought and won, but overall, you're like heading towards the ultimate goal.
All right. I hope everyone got their questions answered. And of course, if you did not, please follow Dr. Franco on her social platforms and please get her book. And I'm so honored that we were asked to take this quiz. I'm going to put that in the chat one more time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Here's the quiz, or the survey, sorry. Thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Yeah, happy to connect with all of you. Good luck connecting, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.